YouTube, this is Noise of Van Productions, and welcome to the next episode of Concerning the Godzilla Saga. Now let's dive on into the characters, specifically the scientist characters of the first novel of the book, Godzilla, of the series, Godzilla King Kong, The Battle of Earth. Ridiculous title, but I don't care. First things first, we have Charles Clarkson. Charles Clarkson is probably the most important character of the scientists, and so I'm going to start with him. Now, he is described as being this socially awkward but kind of curious boy. His mother was Filipino and his father was American. He was an American stationed over in the Philippines for a while, met his mother, and boom, look, they had a baby. That baby was Charles Clarkson. But he was always out, Charles as a child was always outside, either playing or looking at wildlife in general. He was extremely difficult to deal with in school as a result. He always just wanted to be outside, he always just wanted to play in the dirt, he always wanted to just kind of explore the woods, see what he can find, because that's what kind of kid he was. And he would often spend recess watching ants and looking at birds, and he would oftentimes be alone. Because, you know, he couldn't go outside a certain area at school, so he'd often just kind of be there alone, just sort of watching nature as a whole. As a result, Clarkson learned to really love science. He absolutely loved that particular area. Like, he couldn't wait during the school day to go into the science area. And specifically, he loved biology. He basically took advanced courses in high school and got all the best grades in the class. He dominated science. He was like the kid in his particular grade when it came to science. And he was consistently and constantly encouraged by his teachers and professors to take up the field of biology and specifically college, because mainly he showed a lot of potential. He showed a lot of potential of both doing something good, either being a good teacher, being a good professor, or just simply being in the field itself. Basically, he was awarded a lot of scholarships as well because of both his grades were really good and also he was just excelling so much in the area of science, particularly, again, biology. Now, during senior year of high school, Clarkson learned about the Godzilla attack in 1954 in a history class. And he himself became very curious because that also mixed a lot of what he loved, biology and stuff like that, with history. Which history was certainly not his strong suit. But he was curious and found himself obsessing over this attack and the actual dinosaur itself, the actual Godzillasaurus. And he wrote his actual final science thesis on the Godzillasaurus species as a whole. Now, granted, a lot of it was speculation due to so little information. I mean, other than what was speculated by Dr. Yamane in 1954 all the way through the 1980s, and Sarah Connolly and Raymond Connolly on Bassin Island, there wasn't really much to go on. So a lot of it was basically his hypotheses and him trying to draw conclusions based on evidence that they had gathered and that he basically speculated upon from his research. What was fact was mainly based on, again, the research by Sarah Connolly. Clarkson looked at Sarah Connolly as a hero. Now, we'll get to her a little bit later in this video, actually right after this character, but he looked at her as a hero. He worshipped her. He always wanted to go to Bassin Island to study the Godzillasaurus, aka Minla, and he formed basically a kind of hero worship over her. He always desperately wanted to meet her. She was his inspiration for just about everything. And, you know, she was the reason why he ultimately wrote the book that we'll get into in a little bit. He's the reason why he graduated college, he went to college. He's the reason why he took up biology, was because he sort of obsessed over her, not in a creepy way, but he just really, really was inspired by her work. In college, Clarkson was the top of his class for the first 3 years of his schooling. He still pursued his passion in discovering more about the specific Godzillasaurus and began to research the topic in order to write a book. He had always wanted to write a book on the Godzillasaurus species, and particularly the 1954 attack in that particular Godzilla. And so he wanted to write a book about that, and he kept pursuing his dreams. And so eventually he did. When he was only 25, Clarkson finished the book. It told about the attack, Godzilla's origins, and the differences in the species, and their possible social structure, the alpha males and everything, so on and so forth, and their habitats. So he didn't just dive into one particular species of Godzillasaurus. By the time he was 25, they'd already discovered like the Godzillasaurus giganticus in the northern North America hemisphere and the fossils and so on and so forth. So he started digging into that as well. It's a very in-depth book, probably the most in-depth book written about the Godzillasaurus species and Godzilla in general at the time period. The book was actually a bestseller in the scientific community. However, it was hailed by few but laughed at by most. So it was very popular. People were buying it left and right, but a lot of people were criticizing it and tearing it apart. And very few people really took it serious. Fellow scientists or fellow biologists or not, very few took it serious. Many biologists scoffed at both Clarkson's age, him only being 25 at the time when he wrote the book, and also his usage of speculation based on his research. Again, very little in the book was actual fact, and that's very key in Godzilla and King Kong, the first novel, is that they know very, 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 very little about the Godzillasaurus species. And so a lot of what Clarkson is creating is basically taking what he's looking at and taking the research that he's done and making a speculation as to this is how it's kind of happened. In a real life sense, it was almost kind of like Walking with Dinosaurs. Walking with Dinosaurs was treated like a nature documentary. They basically took both research of wildlife in our time and both, fossils and research and so on and so forth from the time of the dinosaurs. And combining the two, they sort of made this documentary series. It's kind of like that. Even though Walking with Dinosaurs now is really dated and not very accurate anymore, it was kind of like that. That's basically what this book was like. However, Clarkson was hailed in the book. This is the one thing that was hailed in his book. Clarkson was hailed for his research on the effects of radiation on the body. He was hailed for that. However, the book as a whole made Clarkson mocked at both his schools and by his professors. Now, Clarkson dropped out of college. He dropped out of college because of this. He took many, many, many courses in biology right up until he was 25. And he, despite dropping out of college, he began to be called to lectures at several schools to discuss radiation. Again, that was one of the things that he was extremely hailed for in his book. And basically, he began to travel around the country, and he was paid extremely well. By the age of 28, Clarkson was bored with his lectures. He wanted to continue his research on Godzilla and even make a new book, updating the original one. But however, he understood that there was little interest and money in that particular field, other than with Sarah Connolly. He still really wanted to travel with her. So Clarkson waited for an opportunity to land at his door. Until then, he considered his interest in the Godzillasaurus species as a mere hobby. And that is where his character begins in Godzilla and King Kong. Now, the next character is Sarah Connolly. Now, she was the granddaughter of Raymond Connolly. Now, by the time this video is released, I would have already released a video on Bassin Island. Bassin Island sort of discusses Raymond Connolly and how he was the person that discovered the baby Godzillasaurus on the island itself. She was always close to Raymond Connolly, she being his granddaughter. And he basically raised her due to her father always moving around. Sarah's father was hardly ever there for Sarah. It was always her grandfather. And he inspired her to study biology in school. So she did, with the sole purpose of studying Minla and taking over the research facility once Raymond died, because Raymond was getting old by the time she was able to go on the island itself. She had like this nice little friendly rivalry with her grandfather. It wasn't anything mean-spirited or anything. They were totally friendly about it. They would often call each other names and insult each other frequently, and this made many of the people working on the Bassin Island Research Station think that they didn't like each other very much, when in fact it was the opposite. It meant that they loved each other ridiculously. And Sarah often looked at Raymond as her actual dad, even though he was her grandfather. And she was actually the one that named the Godzillasaurus Minla. It was a cute little pet name. And the name, because it was kind of cute, it stuck. All the researchers on the island began to refer to the Godzillasaurus as such. Everyone now was starting to call it Minla. Minla was now being put down on papers. Minla his name was changed in the computer system to Minla. Everyone just started calling him Minla, and the name just kind of stuck. That also occurred in the UN, that occurred with the news stations and everything. People just stopped referring to this Godzillasaurus as the Godzillasaurus, and changed it to Minla. Just to give it a little more individuality as well. It sort of made sense. Now, despite the fact that Sarah Connolly was an American citizen, she actually really lived in Sydney, Australia. That's where she bought her own personal home, but she rarely visited that home. She rarely visited the house that she bought in Sydney. She bought it mainly to feel that she will always have a place to go home to, even if something bad happened on Bassin Island. She would always have basically a home to go home to bring some basic stability in her life, some more stability, that there was always something she could kind of go back to. And this wasn't because she didn't like her job. She absolutely loved her job on Bassin Island. She would live there her entire life if she could. But she was that kind of person that always had like a backup option to everything. She was just that kind of person. She considered her real home actually to be the research station on Bassin Island. She also has a high-end room there for her own personal use once she takes over when Raymond dies. That was basically her house. Almost all of her personal belongings were actually on that island. It was really her home. Everything about that island was actually her home. Now, when Raymond Connolly died, Sarah fell apart. She loved her dad. I want to stress that very much so. She loved her dad, but not like Raymond, not like her grandfather. When he died, she became even more reclusive and less social amongst the team on Bassin Island. She became very reclusive, for good and for bad. She became very, very, though ironically it was this time period of her mourning the loss of her grandfather, where she created a lot of her research that would basically make her even more famous amongst the scientific community, and would lead her, or lead Clarkson to finding about her, ironically. But she would often spend days at a time outside and near Minla to study him, and solely him. And this was mainly for her own sake, as she began to cope with the loss of Raymond. She found peace in just kind of studying Minla and just being outside constantly. She would spend days at a time out there and not even talk to anyone else on the island, and just remain out there in a tent, or sometimes she didn't even bring a tent, she would just be outside. Because of her dedication and interest in Minla, many discoveries are made at this time period. She both proves and disproves many of the things that Dr. Yamane, who lived up until the 1980s, and her grandfather speculated on. One of them being that the species does not function like a normal organic being. She proves that. She says, for some reason, the Godzillasaurus species as a whole can withstand radiation and even consume it, which goes against every biology textbook ever. So the Godzillasaurus species is such an oddball, but she's the one that proves it. And Sarah wants to figure out why that is. She wants to consider why, and considers this, above protecting Minla, as her main purpose. She considers finding out why they are so different her main purpose in life. As a result of this time period, Sarah grows extremely attached to Minla. She sees the innocence in him and knows he is not aggressive. He's not an aggressive creature unless provoked. Basically like a bear, almost. A normal bear, a black bear, will not attack you unless you do something to aggravate it. Minla is very much so the same way. And she almost looks at Minla as like her own child or her own pet, which some people made fun of her for, but most people highly respected, because basically her entire family revolved around Minla. She is dead fast against the idea of making Minla a public attraction, and is willing to almost do anything to protect him. Because what was happening at the time was the UN was losing money at the time, so they needed to bring in more money, and they thought about making Minla kind of a Jurassic Park-like, public attraction. She was dead fast against that, and she ultimately won the case in the UN to leave that area private, to leave Bassin Island itself private and in the hands of the UN, so no one can get in or get out without specific approval from either the UN and the research facility team, but specifically the research facility team, and especially her. It was through this, though, that made the UN grow pretty angry with her, but most of the members still admired all the information that she was able to gather over the years as she served. So it was kind of like there was a respect level there that she had that basically allowed her to pull a couple strings. Now, what happened was when Flora hit Earth, the meteor that hit Earth that nearly wiped out all of Hawaii, it started a chain reaction. A day later, the once extinct volcano on Bassin Island just exploded. And when I mean exploded, it wiped out the island as a whole. Sarah was actually on her way to Bassin Island from Sydney when the explosion went off. And because of the explosion, she was knocked unconscious in the helicopter and had no idea how she wound up back in a hospital in Sydney. But all she knows is that Minla is missing and wants desperately to find him. Which that is where her story begins in Godzilla King Kong, is her desperately wanting to find where Minla has gone. Now the final character we're going to talk about is Professor Dominique DeMorris, who he was born in Washington State. He is by far the oldest one out of the three scientists here. He was born in Washington State, and from a young age he knew science was his life's purpose. Specifically, the effects of nuclear radiation and energy. He was sought after heavily during the second Iraq-Iran war. He was hired because if you listen to that video, you'll know that nuclear energy basically began to explode during that time period because we were looking for alternatives to oil because of the bloodbath that was going on overseas. He was hired to help develop safe and easy nuclear reactors to prevent meltdowns and leaks. Now, DeMorris was extremely good at this and efficient. He basically mixed his knowledge of radiation that he studied his entire life, because by the time he was doing this, he was almost 50 years old. And the knowledge of radiation, no, he was like probably 40, in between 40 and 45. But he mixed his knowledge of radiation and his knowledge of engineering. You see, his father was an engineer. And so he kind of picked things up from his father. His father basically taught him a lot. His father would build buildings. In fact, his father worked heavily in Seattle. So he learned how to build things and build them efficiently. So he basically mixed the two there. And what happened was like the perfect mix. He was able to design things and he was able to make them efficient, cheap and costly, and also make them work. Because of his knowledge of radiation. He was hired by several private companies, not just one, but several private companies, to basically overhaul old nuclear reactors and replace them with these new ones that DeMorris had basically designed from the ground up. And he specifically worked over in the East Coast. There's a lot more on the East Coast than there were on the West Coast. The ones being built on the West Coast were new, that he completely designed from the ground up. Over on the East Coast was a little bit more of a challenge because a lot of these buildings were old. They were built in the 1970s. You know, they are many, many decades old. And so he basically had to upgrade them, which he saw as a challenge, and he took it up. He basically redesigned them based on their old platforms. So basically just a massive upgrade. He created a new fail-safe system on all of them. He created a patent, and basically each company would buy the right to be able to use that patent, and then he would work on the individual reactors. This made DeMorris an extremely rich man. He was loaded. He's definitely probably the richest character in the Godzilla Saga, period. After 4 years of doing this, however, DeMorris wanted out. He just wanted to stop working on these reactors because he was bored. He felt bored and tired of using the same thing over and over and over again. But he admitted to himself that the money was really nice. Basically, from this point on, he was basically doing it just for the money. Now, when the second Iraq-Iran war ended and utterly humiliated the United States, he stopped working on nuclear reactors altogether. He basically had a young assistant that he had replace him. DeMorris knew that the man was both ambitious and had more drive to complete the work, so he just handed it off to him and retired himself. And almost immediately after retiring, DeMorris was hired by Washington State University to teach both an engineering course and several radiation classes for the science department. And he was heavily sought after by his students. The students loved him, and they found DeMorris extremely relatable and unbelievably humble, which is why a lot of people will go to him. A lot of people relied on him, and a lot of people understood him. DeMorris at this point began to live a simpler life. Before that, he was moving around all the time. Now he just kind of wanted to stay in one place. He bought a nice house with all the money that he earned. He bought a really, really nice, gorgeous house with all the money that he'd been saving up while working on the reactors. But he wanted to live alone. He never sought after a girlfriend or a wife. He never sought after really settling down in terms of like that. He would rather live by himself, and he was very content to live by himself. He feels much happier teaching at Washington State University and living simply than when he worked on the reactors. And basically it was during this time period that he took actual interest a little bit. He took interest in listening to the music of Wagner. And he's actually often found listening to the composer's music during his downtimes both on and off campus. Now for 3 years, DeMorris taught a class that mixed history and science. He taught a course that basically delved into the Godzilla attack on Japan in 1954, which focused on the effects of radiation and the hypothesized biology of the creature. Again, using a lot of Sarah Connolly's research, Raymond Connolly's research, Dr. Imani's research, even though a lot of his research was dated, and yes, even Charles Clarkson. He was one of the few professors that loved Clarkson's book and used it to help teach that specific course. However, as the 3 years went on, enrollment for the class was getting poorer and poorer, and the result was eventually the administration shut down the course. And it makes sense. It was a good practical business thing. Why should we teach you when no one wants? Why should we be paying you to teach this course that no one wants to take? The class was shut down, and DeMorris didn't really think anything about it. He thought it was just sort of a fun class that lasted for a while, and now he just has to move on with his life. That's the kind of character that DeMorris is. Now, he currently teaches the hardest science courses at the university. Only the best of the best make it into his particular classes. And DeMorris is extremely happy to continue with what he is doing for the rest of his life. He's perfectly content to teaching these students for the rest of his life and living his simple life. However, little did he know about the meteor flora hitting Hawaii, and little did he know about the Godzilla coming back, this new Godzilla coming back to life, which that is where his story begins on Godzilla and King Kong. So, ladies and gentlemen, go on Facebook, like the Godzilla Saga for all up-to-date information there. Go on Facebook, like AN Productions for all up-to-date information on that. Stay tuned for some short films being released. I don't know if they'd be released by the time this comes out or not. Whatever. Also, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment telling me what you think or what else you would like to see. And in the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying sayonara.